She was left to burn in the fire, but she didn't die. She rose, stronger, sharper, unstoppable. The man who tried to bury her is now begging behind bars, and the billionaire who once watched from afar now stands by her side. This isn't just revenge, it's a rebirth. Watch how a broken woman turns her pain into power and becomes the storm they never saw coming. Hey, my family, how are you doing today? I hope you're all doing amazing. So tell me, where are you listening to me from? Come on now, I've been asking this for so long, and honestly I'm a little disappointed because no one's replying. I just want to know where my voice reaches. Does it touch your heart or not? So please don't be shy, drop it in the comments and let me know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now. All right, family, let's dive into the story. The night was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be just another night in the house Stuart had built with every ounce of love she had poured into her marriage. The curtains swayed gently against the soft breeze, the photographs on the wall still framed memories of laughter, and the faint scent of cinnamon candles lingered in the air like a warm whisper. But everything changed in the blink of an eye, as the calm she once knew was ripped apart by the violent roar of flames bursting through the living room windows like monsters unleashed from hell. The fire crackled, hissed, and devoured everything it touched, as if the universe itself had decided to burn down the chapter of her life she once called safe. The heat slammed into Stuart like a living thing, wrapping around her skin, pressing against her lungs, making every breath a battle between life and death. She staggered backward, her hands reaching for anything to ground her, but all she felt was the heat licking her wrists and the smoke thickening until it blurred the world into a choking darkness. The sound of wood splintering and glass shattering filled the air, a chaotic symphony that drowned out the silence of the life she once knew. Her eyes darted toward the doorway through the thick curtain of smoke, and that's when her heart froze. There he was, Mike. The man who once whispered forever into her ear, the man who kissed her forehead on rainy nights and promised to never let harm touch her. He stood at the doorway not as a savior, but as a stranger carved in coldness. His face was expressionless, his eyes like black stones, reflecting the flames without feeling their heat. In that moment, Stuart's brain struggled to understand what her heart already knew. He wasn't coming to save her. He wasn't reaching for her. He wasn't running to pull her out of the fire. His lips curved into something cruel, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. It was enough to slice through every illusion she had ever wrapped around their marriage. Her voice broke through the chaos, raw and desperate. "Mike!" "Please," she coughed, the smoke scraping her throat like shards of glass, and stumbled closer to the doorway, her trembling fingers reaching out. But instead of stepping in, instead of reaching back, Mike took a single step backward, a deliberate step. The house groaned as another beam cracked overhead, raining sparks down on her shoulders. Her hair singed, her lungs screamed for air, and still she stared at him, at the man she loved. At the man who was supposed to protect her. His eyes held no mercy, no love, just a silent verdict. She was meant to burn. He turned, slowly, coldly. He turned his back on her as her world fell apart behind him. A scream ripped from her throat, but the flames swallowed it whole. She crashed to her knees, the heat blistering her skin, her vision spinning in dizzying loops of fire and betrayal. Her mind replayed the moment they exchanged vows, the way his hand had trembled when he slipped the ring on her finger, the way he promised, in sickness and in health, in darkness and in light. "I'll be there," lies, all of it, every kiss, every promise, every smile. It was all a mask. She pushed herself up again, her legs shaking, the floorboards scorching beneath her bare feet. The living room, the same room where they once danced barefoot under the soft glow of the chandelier, was now a nightmare of orange and red, walls collapsing in on themselves. She coughed again, harder this time, as black smoke clawed down her throat, making her eyes water. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs, but somewhere beneath the fear, something sharp and hot began to bloom. It wasn't just the fire, it was rage. The ceiling above her cracked like thunder. A fiery beam fell, smashing into the floor inches away, sending a spray of sparks against her skin. Pain seared across her arms, but she didn't scream. She clenched her teeth. She was not going to die here. Not like this. Not in a house that once smelled like cinnamon and love, now reeking of betrayal and smoke. She stumbled forward, coughing, crawling, clawing at the wooden floor until her fingernails split. Outside, faintly, she could hear voices, neighbors screaming, sirens in the distance, the sound of footsteps running. But none of them were his. None of them belonged to Mike. The man she loved was gone, his silhouette fading into the night like a shadow that never intended to stay. Her chest tightened, not just from the smoke, but from the crushing weight of that truth. He left. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. Her vision blurred as another wave of smoke surged through the room like a living beast, wrapping around her throat, making her stumble. Her hands pressed against the floor, her nails digging into the wood as she crawled toward the hallway. The photographs on the wall melted and dripped to the floor like wax tears. She caught sight of one, their wedding photo, their smiles frozen in a moment she now knew meant nothing. The glass cracked, splintering across their faces as if the fire itself was mocking her pain. The air grew hotter, louder. The house screamed as if it were alive and angry. Stuart dragged herself through the heat, her hair sticking to her face, sweat mixing with ash and tears. The walls began to crumble behind her, the fire chasing her like it wanted to claim her. But inside her, somewhere beneath the smoke, beneath the broken ribs, beneath the betrayal, a voice rose, soft but fierce. "I will not die like this." Her hand slammed against the doorknob, but it was too hot to touch. The skin on her palm sizzled, but she didn't let go. She gritted her teeth and pushed, kicking at the bottom of the door with what little strength she had left. Another crack echoed above her head as burning debris rained down, catching the hem of her nightdress. Flames licked at her legs, and she screamed, slapping at them, rolling against the blackened floor, coughing and crying as she fought to stay conscious. Then, a crash. The window. Someone outside. A beam of light cut through the thick smoke. "Somebody's in there!" a voice shouted. She tried to scream back, but her throat was raw, her voice broken. Her hand lifted weakly toward the light, fingers trembling. She was seconds away from losing everything, from disappearing into the fire the same way her husband disappeared into the night. The smoke tightened its grip around her lungs, and her vision dimmed to a tunnel of light. She thought this was it. But then, hands. Strong, unfamiliar hands reached through the shattered glass, pulling her out with a strength she didn't have left. She felt her body lift, felt the cold night air rush against her burned skin, felt the rain that had just started falling hiss against the fire still clinging to the house. She was dragged across the wet grass as sirens wailed closer, strangers yelling instructions she couldn't hear. Her vision blurred between smoke and stars, her breath shallow, her heart pounding against a cage of broken bones. They wrapped her in a blanket, voices blurred together, the world spinning around her. The paramedics shouted something about burns, oxygen, hospital, but Stuart wasn't listening. Her gaze through the haze locked on the street, on the empty space where Mike should have been. He wasn't there. No shadow, no guilt, just emptiness. Her lips trembled, not from the cold, but from the realization slicing through her chest like glass. He wanted her to die. Not an accident, not a mistake. He walked away. A spark of hatred lit deep inside her. Quiet, but fierce. As they loaded her into the ambulance, rain began to pour heavier, washing soot and blood from her face. She didn't feel the pain fully yet. Shock wrapped around her like a numb blanket. But she felt something shift inside her. Something crack. Something dangerous. The hospital ceiling blurred above her as nurses rushed around. Machines beeped, hands touched her face, wrapped her burns, injected morphine, whispered words she couldn't fully process. But even as her body gave in, her mind held onto a single image. Mike's face at the doorway, unmoving, uncaring. That image branded itself into her memory like the flames had branded her skin. Hours later, in the stillness of the hospital room, the storm outside softened. The world seemed too calm for the chaos raging inside her. Her hands were wrapped in white bandages, her breath steadied by oxygen, her skin aching with every beat of her heart. But beneath all that pain was something colder, sharper, a vow forming like steel. She turned her head slightly, staring out the hospital window at the rain streaking down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman scorched, broken, but alive. A woman who had been left to burn. A woman who refused to die. And in that silent, sterile room, she whispered to the darkness, to herself, to the night that tried to claim her, "I'll rise from these ashes." The words left her lips not as a plea, but as a warning to the world that had tried to erase her. Miles away, under the same rain, Mike poured himself a drink, his lips curling in satisfaction, convinced she was gone forever. He didn't know. He didn't see the fire still burning behind her eyes. Love died that night. But something far more powerful was born. And somewhere in the shadows, fate smiled. Because this wasn't the end of Stuart's story. It was the beginning. The rain had long stopped beating against the hospital window, but inside Stuart's chest, the storm never really ceased. Days turned into nights, and nights into the kind of silence that stretched like a shadow with no end. She spent weeks wrapped in bandages, trapped not just in a bed but inside the quiet rage of someone who had seen death up close and decided to spit in its face. Machines beeped in steady rhythm beside her, marking time she wasn't sure she wanted, but every beep reminded her. She was still here, still breathing, and he hadn't won. At first, the pain was all she knew. Her body throbbed with burns that ached like they were carved from fire itself. Her lungs were raw from smoke, and her bones ached in the cold hours of the night when the world outside fell silent. But worse than the pain in her flesh was the hollowed-out space in her chest where love used to live. It was quiet there now, quiet and sharp. Nurses came and went. Doctors spoke in clipped tones about recovery, about grafts, about therapy. But no one spoke about the betrayal that cut deeper than the flames. No one saw the image that still lived behind her eyelids, Mike's cold stare framed by fire. It replayed like a broken film reel every time she closed her eyes. She learned to sleep with the lights on because darkness carried his shadow. But every wound has a moment where it stops bleeding and starts hardening into something else. Stuart's reflection changed slowly. Bandages came off one layer at a time, revealing skin that would never look the same again. But what surprised her most wasn't the scars themselves. It was the woman looking back at her through them. Her eyes had sharpened, like steel forged in pain. The softness that once lived there was buried beneath layers of something new. Power. She began to move again, first with hesitation, then with defiance. Steps down the hospital corridor turned into longer walks outside. She breathed in the scent of rain after a storm, felt the cold sting of air against her healing skin, and realized for the first time that she didn't need Mike to survive. She never did. The fire took everything he built around her, but it couldn't take the fire that now lived within her. Weeks bled into months. She packed a single suitcase, left the city where every street whispered his name, and boarded a bus with no destination written in her heart except away. She watched the skyline disappear through the fogged glass, her reflection superimposed on the lights she once called home. There was no more home. There was just her, and the promise she whispered the night she almost died. "I'll rise from these ashes." She landed in a new city where no one knew the sound of her name, a place where the streets were busy enough to swallow her pain and give it no voice. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore, its walls painted white like a blank page. Every day, she built herself back up, one breath at a time. Therapy sessions became confessionals. Jogging in the cold became a ritual of strength. She stared at her scars not with shame, but with the quiet understanding that they were proof she had walked through fire and lived. She cut her hair shorter, sharper, as if slicing off the last threads that still tied her to her past. She wore dark lipstick not to hide, but to declare. The woman who once whispered her pain now wore it like armor. People on the street looked at her scars, some with pity, some with curiosity, but she walked past them like their gazes meant nothing. Because they didn't. What she didn't know was that strength has a way of catching the eye of those who see beyond the surface. One night, months after leaving, she stood in front of her mirror in a fitted black dress, the kind she hadn't dared to wear since before the fire. The fabric hugged her curves like a silent reminder. She was still here. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the neckline, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was power vibrating beneath her skin, waiting to be unleashed. The city lights outside her window cast a soft halo around her figure, reflecting a woman who was no longer defined by what happened to her, but by what she was becoming. She was on her way to a charity gala, her first public event since the fire. The thought of stepping into a room full of strangers made her chest tighten, but a whisper inside urged her on. This was not about blending in. This was about reclaiming space she had once surrendered. The ballroom was alive with glittering chandeliers and the hum of expensive laughter. Crystal glasses clinked, the scent of roses mingled with expensive colognes, and every inch of the place screamed of wealth and power. Stuart moved through the crowd with her shoulders straight, chin lifted. Her scars were not hidden beneath makeup, they glimmered faintly under the soft lighting like battle medals. A few people stared, but they looked away when they met her gaze. Her eyes had weight now. Then she felt it. A stare that didn't flinch. Across the room, Cameron stood tall, wearing a dark tailored suit that wrapped his broad shoulders in quiet power. His presence wasn't loud, but it commanded the space around him effortlessly. His gaze wasn't like the others. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was recognition, like he saw the storm beneath her skin and didn't look away. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the sound of music and chatter dulled to nothing. There was just that gaze, warm, steady, unwavering. Stuart inhaled slowly, her heartbeat stumbling against the weight of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not desire, not love, but being seen, truly seen. Mini cliffhanger. And for a woman who had once been invisible to the man she loved, being seen was dangerous. Cameron began to walk toward her, not with the arrogant stride of men who were used to owning rooms, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone who knew exactly who he was. Each step closed the distance, and Stuart felt the weight of her walls press against the pulse in her throat. She could turn away. She could leave, but she didn't. When he finally stood before her, his cologne was subtle, warm, cedar and smoke. "You look like someone who doesn't flinch," he said softly, almost like a challenge wrapped in a compliment. Her lips curved, not quite into a smile, but something sharper. "And you look like someone who notices too much." His chuckle was low, genuine. Only what matters. Their conversation started like that. A spark struck between steel and fire. She didn't tell him her story, and he didn't ask. But he looked at her like he already knew she had one. He spoke about the city, about the foundation the gala was for, about books and music and little things that wrapped around her in quiet warmth. Hours bled away. She hadn't laughed like that in months. She hadn't felt the weight on her chest ease, not like this. He didn't look at her scars. He looked at her eyes. Later, they found themselves outside on the terrace, city lights scattered like stars beneath them. The air was cooler, brushing against her skin like a soft hand. Stuart leaned against the railing, her dress glinting faintly beneath the moonlight. Cameron stood beside her, hands in his pockets, silent but steady. "It's strange," she murmured, more to the night than to him. "How a single night can change everything." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. Sometimes a night is all it takes to burn the past down. The word burn hung between them like smoke. Her throat tightened, the memory of fire flashing behind her eyelids. He didn't know. How could he? And yet, something in the way he said it made her heartbeat shift. She met his gaze. "And what happens after the fire?" Cameron stepped closer, just enough that his warmth brushed against her without touching. "Then you rise." The words hit her harder than she expected. No one had said them to her before. No one had looked at her like he just did, not like a fragile survivor, but like a storm in waiting. For the first time since the fire, her heart didn't just beat, it roared. They talked until the ballroom emptied and the night stretched into a quiet hum. Cameron didn't push, didn't pry. He listened. He laughed. He watched her with a gaze that felt like safety wrapped in strength. And when the night grew still, when the moon sat high above them like a silent witness, Cameron leaned in just enough for his breath to brush against her ear. His voice was low, steady, deliberate. "I want to help you burn down the man who burned you." The words weren't a question, they were a promise. And in that moment, under the soft glow of city lights, Stuart felt something ignite inside her that wasn't pain anymore. It was power. The sound of Cameron's low, steady breathing beside her felt like a new kind of heartbeat, steady and unshakable, and yet Stuart's mind was already moving through shadows. The night after he whispered his vow to stand by her, she stood in front of the tall glass windows of his penthouse, the city's skyline stretching beneath her like a glittering chessboard, every light a possible move, every shadow a reminder of what she'd survived. The world was vast, alive, waiting to be taken back piece by piece, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like the broken woman who crawled through flames. She felt like the flame itself. Cameron moved behind her, silent but powerful, his presence filling the room in a way that didn't suffocate her. It fortified her. His hands didn't reach for her like she was fragile. They hovered like an ally respecting a warrior's space. "You don't have to face the past alone," he murmured, his voice deep, grounded, as if it carried the weight of storms. She didn't turn to him right away. Instead, she let her reflection stare back at her in the window, stronger now, sharper. "I'm not facing the past," she whispered slowly, tasting the words like fire. "I'm hunting it." The next morning, she walked through the gleaming marble halls of Cameron's world, the echo of her heels against the cold floor becoming a rhythm she hadn't heard in a long time. Power. His empire was different from Mike's world of false smiles and cheap charm. It pulsed with something real, something earned, something built from storms and steel. Cameron had carved his life out of nothing, and Stuart found herself learning to stand taller simply by walking beside him. Every employee in his building looked at her with quiet respect, sensing that she was not just another woman on his arm. She was a force in the making. But power always drags shadows behind it, and Stuart could feel the whispers of her past, trailing her like smoke, curling under doors. That afternoon, Cameron's chief of security, a broad-shouldered man with ice in his eyes, handed her a thick black folder. "Everything you asked for," he said simply. Stuart didn't flinch as she opened it. Inside were photographs, bank transfers, property deeds, and headlines, pieces of Mike's new life. He hadn't vanished into nothing. He'd flourished, married again, bought mansions, thrown charity parties, wore tailored suits, and smiled like a man who'd never lit his wife's life on fire. The sight of his face didn't break her like it would have months ago. It sharpened something inside her chest into a blade. Her fingers tightened around the glossy photo of him laughing at some gala, his arm wrapped around a woman with diamond earrings and practiced innocence. That woman had no idea what kind of monster she was holding on to. She exhaled slowly, almost soundlessly, as if testing how rage now felt in her lungs. It no longer choked her. It fueled her. Cameron stepped closer, not asking if she was okay, because he already knew this wasn't a moment for softness. "Do you want me to destroy him?" he asked quietly, like someone offering a blade, not a hug. Stuart tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as a cruel smile ghosted her lips. "No," she murmured, "I want to do it myself." Later that night, while the city thrummed below, Stuart sat in Cameron's study, an expansive room of leather and dark wood, alone with the folder spread across the desk like a battlefield map. Each line of ink was a path to his ruin. She traced the accounts first, following the blood trail of Mike's greed. Offshore holdings, silent partnerships, fake charities. Her eyes caught on a wire transfer from the night of the fire. Her blood cooled. He had planned everything. It wasn't rage this time. It was precision, the kind a blade has when it slides between ribs. Her fingers pressed harder against the paper as memories tried to claw their way back, his cold stare at the burning doorway, the smoke clawing her throat, the betrayal deeper than the flames. But she didn't let the memory consume her. She pinned it down like prey. She found a familiar signature on one of those accounts. It wasn't just Mike. Someone else had helped him. Someone close. She leaned back in the chair, heart thudding in slow, dangerous beats, and whispered, "So it wasn't just you, Mike, was it?" The following morning, Cameron walked into the study to find her already awake, dressed in a fitted black outfit that hugged her like armor, her hair pulled back, eyes bright with something dark and beautiful. "You didn't sleep," he noted. She didn't deny it. "Who needs sleep when there are monsters to unmask?" she replied. He stepped closer, scanning the evidence she'd marked with red ink and sticky notes, and for the first time, Cameron saw not just a woman rebuilding, but a general leading a war. As she flipped one page, a blurry photograph of Mike and an unknown man exchanging a handshake made Cameron's jaw tighten. "Who's that?" he asked. Stuart's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Someone who's going to regret ever knowing him." Later that evening, they attended a charity gala together, one of the many glamorous events where Mike's name floated like perfume in the air. Stuart wore a black satin gown that dripped elegance and quiet fury. Every move she made commanded the room's attention. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, but none of them mattered except the ghosts she came to haunt. As champagne glasses clinked and laughter curled like smoke, she spotted a headline flashing across a TV screen at the bar. Mike's smiling face next to his new fiancée's, both glowing with staged perfection. Something inside her stilled. It didn't hurt. It calcified into strategy. Her hand trembled for just a breath, and Cameron's fingers found hers, not to save her, but to anchor her. She didn't lean into him. She stood taller. The tremble became steel. The fear that used to live behind her ribs was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, clarity. She whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for him to hear, "He thinks he won. He has no idea the storm he created." The night deepened. The gala lights softened, and she found herself standing on the balcony, looking down at the same city where she once begged for life. Now, the same city would witness his fall. "Are you ready for this?" Cameron asked from behind her. Stuart didn't look back. "I was ready the moment he walked away from me." She turned slowly, and in the soft golden light, her scars caught the glow, not as wounds, but as warnings. She picked up the newspaper that someone had left on a nearby table. Mike's smile stared up at her from the glossy front page, arrogant and oblivious. She traced a finger down his face, slowly, almost lovingly, until it reached his mouth. "You'll soon regret breathing," she whispered, a promise written in steel and smoke. Somewhere across the city, Mike laughed over a glass of expensive whiskey, unaware that the woman he thought was dead had just marked the beginning of his end. The night air was sharp, carrying the kind of cold that wakes up the soul, and Stuart stood at the edge of Cameron's balcony with the city spread beneath her like a glittering map of possibilities. Just hours ago, she'd stared at Mike's smile in a newspaper, tracing his face like a hunter memorizing prey. Now, she was standing above the world that had once buried her, and for the first time, she felt its heartbeat in her own pulse. Cameron stepped out onto the balcony behind her, the sound of his polished shoes quiet but deliberate. He didn't disturb the silence with shallow comfort. He simply stood near, letting the power of that shared quiet settle between them. In the reflection of the glass, she could see him watching her, not as someone broken, but as a woman building something terrifyingly beautiful. "Are you ready to step into the fire again?" Cameron's voice was low, steady, and threaded with something dangerous: admiration. Stuart tilted her chin slightly, her eyes fixed on the night. "No," she said softly. "This time, I'm the one holding the match." It started with whispers, not thunder. That was how power worked best, not loud, but precise. Cameron wasn't just a millionaire, he was a tactician. His mind was a labyrinth of quiet wars and invisible empires, and Stuart, sharp, scarred, and relentless, was the perfect storm to unleash through it. Over the following weeks, his offices became their war room. Thick mahogany tables were covered in financial records, old connections, dummy accounts, and detailed maps of Mike's empire. Cameron explained how companies could bleed from the inside without a single headline, how trust could be unraveled from a single handshake. Stuart listened, learned, and then began to lead. One night, she traced a red line across a document, connecting two shell companies, and whispered, "This is where we start cutting off his oxygen." She slipped into roles like silk, an investor with a sharp tongue, a socialite with quiet power, a name that people started whispering at high-end events. Her old identity, the woman Mike left to burn, faded like ash on the wind. In her place stood a woman wrapped in calculated elegance. Cameron crafted identities for her like an artist building weapons, forged backgrounds, quiet investments, digital shadows that couldn't be traced back to her true self. Their game was patient. The storm was quiet, for now. But behind every move, there was fire. Cameron would sit across from her at midnight, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, watching the way her mind sliced through numbers and patterns like a blade through silk. He wasn't falling for a fragile woman in need of saving. He was falling for a woman who was learning how to conquer. Sometimes, when she leaned over the documents, a loose strand of her hair would fall forward, and his eyes would soften, not with pity, but with awe. He caught himself thinking, Mike will never even see her coming. One evening, after hours of dissecting Mike's accounts, Stuart leaned back in her chair, the city lights painting her face in soft gold. "Do you ever wonder," she said slowly, "what it feels like to watch everything you built burn down?" Cameron leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze unwavering. "No," he answered, "but I imagine it looks a lot like what Mike will feel soon." A thin smile curved her lips, not one of joy, but one of satisfaction. This wasn't revenge born out of panic anymore. It was a plan born out of power. Weeks turned into layers of infiltration. Stuart and Cameron quietly acquired silent shares in Mike's ventures through intermediaries who didn't even know whose hands were guiding them. Anonymous investors became shadows at board meetings. Emails she once couldn't read now passed through her fingers like silk. Every move Mike made, she was already 3 steps ahead, like a ghost haunting his fortune. And the more control she gained, the more Mike unknowingly fed her everything she needed to break him. One night, a coded message from one of their fake accounts slipped into Mike's private server. Stuart's fingers hovered above the keyboard, a wicked light dancing in her eyes. "Let's feed the monster his own poison," she whispered. But strategy wasn't the only thing growing between them. Late at night, when the world outside quieted and the only sounds were city winds brushing against glass, Stuart would find herself sitting on the balcony again. Cameron always joined her, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a glass of wine, always close enough for her to feel his warmth without needing to ask for it. That night was no different. The sky above was awash of stars, and the city below buzzed like an empire waiting to be conquered. Stuart's breath fogged in the cool air. For the first time, she spoke everything she'd buried. She told him about the night of the fire, how the flames licked her skin like betrayal given breath, how Mike's face burned deeper than any wound. She told him about the strangers who pulled her out when the man she loved turned his back, about the months in the hospital where silence was louder than pain, about the moment she swore she would never beg again. Her voice didn't break, it sharpened as she spoke, each word a brick in the fortress she'd built around her heart. Cameron didn't interrupt, but when she paused, his hand slid over hers, firm, grounding like a man placing a promise without needing to speak it. "I don't need saving," she whispered. "I just need someone who won't flinch when the fire comes back." He squeezed her hand lightly. "Then I'll stand in the fire with you." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far heavier. It was trust, a rare, dangerous thing. For the first time in a long time, Stuart's walls didn't feel like cages. They felt like foundations. She wasn't walking into this war alone. Cameron was not a savior. He was a weapon sharpened beside her. Their alliance began to shift the tides quietly. Rumors started circulating in Mike's social circles. New investors with deep pockets, mysterious faces at high-end events, whispers of power-changing hands. He toasted glasses at galas, smiled for cameras, kissed the air around people who had no idea the ground beneath him was slowly crumbling. Cameron leaned over a folder one night, tapping a document with his finger. "This one move," he said, voice a low hum, "and we'll take the floor out from under him." The night before their biggest move, Stuart stood once again on that balcony, wind tangling through her hair, her chest rising and falling with something fierce. She was no longer the woman who whispered promises to ashes. She was the storm those ashes had birthed. She looked at Cameron, his face carved in quiet determination, and for a second something unspoken passed between them. Not romance in soft colors, but something sharper, deeper, something that could burn and build at the same time. Below, the city glittered like a chessboard, and their pieces were already in play. Far across town, at a grand gala bathed in gold and laughter, Mike raised a glass, his smile smooth and easy, his arm draped around the woman who thought she'd found her prince. He had no idea that the woman he once left to die was already walking through the same doors, wrapped in elegance, holding a storm behind her calm eyes. Stuart stepped into the gala's light like a queen entering enemy territory, her lips curving into a dangerous smile. Mike had no idea the storm had a name, and it was hers. The soft hum of classical music floated like silk through the golden ballroom, every note dripping with wealth and quiet arrogance. Stuart stood at the edge of the grand staircase, the crystal chandelier above casting shards of light across her sleek black dress, making the fabric shimmer like midnight fire. The room was full of polished laughter and champagne, unaware that a storm was walking among them. Her heels pressed against the marble with deliberate grace, each step echoing in her own chest like the beat of a war drum. She wasn't here to blend in. She was here to be seen. She was here to be remembered. She was here to be feared. As she reached the final step, every conversation near the entrance softened, curious eyes lifting toward the woman in black, though none recognized the fire that lay beneath the silk. Mike stood near the bar, surrounded by people who adored the image he'd built, the successful husband, the charming businessman, the man whose smile could convince a room to forget his sins. His glass caught the golden light as he laughed too loud, too freely, as if the world would always bend for him. But the moment his gaze lifted and found hers across the ballroom, time cracked. His hand went slack. The flute of champagne slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a sound that sliced through music and chatter alike. The world narrowed for him into the shape of one woman, Stuart, alive. His pupils dilated in raw disbelief, as if the ghost of the woman he'd buried in fire had clawed her way through the flames to stare straight into his soul. She didn't rush. She didn't tremble. She walked through the crowd with the poise of someone who had already won the war. The scars that ran along her collarbone caught the chandelier's light like silver lines of history, not something to hide, but something to wear like an unbreakable crown. People turned their heads, whispering at her beauty, at her power. But none of them knew the weight of the ashes that had forged her. Her eyes never left Mike. Step by step, she closed the distance. He couldn't breathe. The night of the fire crashed into his mind with brutal force, the heat on his back as he walked away, the sound of her voice calling his name, the creak of the collapsing beams. He'd told himself she was gone. He'd convinced himself the fire had done what he couldn't face. But here she was, breathing, glowing, unstoppable. Mike's hand twitched at his side as if trying to grasp the past, but there was nothing left to hold. When Stuart finally reached him, the room seemed to bend around them. The chatter dimmed, not because they knew the truth, but because power like hers demanded silence. She tilted her head just slightly, her lips curving in a calm, dangerous smile that didn't need sharpness to cut. She leaned just close enough for only him to hear. "Miss me?" Her voice slid through him like a blade wrapped in silk, soft, deadly, unforgettable. He flinched. Before he could answer, Cameron appeared at her side, tall and composed, the weight of old money and new power written in every tailored line of his suit. His hand rested at the small of Stuart's back, subtle but absolute, a message even a fool like Mike couldn't miss. She was not alone. She was not someone to hurt anymore. She was protected, powerful, and untouchable. Mike's jaw tightened, 1,000 curses choking on his tongue. Cameron met his stare with an easy calm, the kind of calm that only men who know they've already won can wear. The smallest curve of Cameron's mouth sent a chill down Mike's spine, because behind that polite smile lived a man with teeth. The crowd was oblivious. To them, it was just another polished encounter between elegant strangers in an ocean of champagne. But beneath that surface, 3 lives tangled. One woman reborn in fire, one man who tried to bury her, and one who stood ready to burn the world for her. Stuart felt the power vibrating beneath her skin. She didn't need to scream, didn't need revenge to look bloody to be real. Her silence was sharper than any blade. She raised her glass and took a slow sip, letting her eyes pierce through Mike like the night she escaped the flames. Mike tried to speak, his voice catching against the lump of guilt, fear, and disbelief swelling in his throat. You're... His words stumbled, like a man trying to climb out of a grave. He dug himself. Stuart's laughter cut him off, low and smooth, the sound of someone who no longer trembles at monsters she's already killed once. That laugh slipped under his skin like smoke from a fire he thought was long dead, reminding him it was never over. Cameron leaned in slightly, his breath brushing the shell of her ear. "He looks like he's seen a ghost," he murmured. Stuart didn't look away from Mike. "He has." It wasn't just a line. It was a sentence, a verdict, and a promise. Mike blinked rapidly, searching for cracks in this reality, waiting for someone to tell him it was a cruel joke. But Stuart's presence was solid, sharp, and louder than any scream. His hand shook as he reached toward her, fingers trembling like a man trying to grasp smoke. But she didn't let him close. Cameron's hand pressed just slightly firmer against her back, not possessive, but anchoring. It reminded her that she wasn't standing in that burning house anymore. She was standing at the top of her power. And Mike was standing at the edge of a cliff he didn't even see coming. She tilted her head and whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "Careful, Mike." Ghosts bite back. Mike's smile faltered as the mask he'd worn so effortlessly for years began to splinter. He could feel the eyes on him, not because anyone knew the truth, but because Stuart's presence made him look weak, and in his world, weakness was death. His chest tightened. The empire he'd built on lies felt suddenly fragile. For a moment, he could feel the fire licking at the edges of his carefully constructed life. Stuart didn't need to push. She didn't need to scream. Just existing was enough to make him crumble. She turned away slightly, giving him the cruelest gift of all, indifference. Cameron moved with her, the pair of them walking past Mike as if he were nothing more than dust beneath their feet. She caught the faint reflection of his face in the glass of the ballroom doors. Panic lived there now, raw and feral. His lips barely moved, but she could read them like a confession written in smoke. "If she's back, I'm finished." She walked deeper into the ballroom, each step pressing a quiet crown onto her head. Conversations resumed around her, but none of it touched the electricity twisting in the air. Cameron's fingers brushed against hers, not to claim her, but to remind her this was her night, her moment. She glanced up at him, and his slight nod said everything he didn't need to speak. Behind them, Mike stared at the shards of glass on the floor where his champagne had shattered. The sound of it echoed in his mind like the splintering of the life he'd built on her ashes. His world wasn't burning yet, but he could smell the smoke. And Stuart, without even turning back, smiled, because she knew the fire was already lit. The music swelled again, chandeliers glittering as if nothing had shifted in the room. But something had. A man who thought he'd buried his sins had just seen them rise from the grave in a black dress and a storm for a heartbeat. Stuart didn't need to win tonight. She just needed to let him know the game had begun, and she had already made her first move simply by walking into the room. Mike's whisper bled into the night air, his knuckles white around an empty glass. "If she's back, I'm finished." The night after the gala wrapped the city in velvet darkness. The echoes of Mike's shocked face still clung to Stuart's mind like a faint whisper she couldn't completely silence. She stood by the tall glass windows of Cameron's penthouse, the skyline stretching like a sea of molten stars beneath them, and for the first time since she returned from the ashes of her old life, she allowed herself to breathe without pretending to be untouchable. The world outside moved with indifferent grace, but inside, beneath the golden hush of dim lights, her pulse trembled with emotions she could no longer bury behind perfectly arched brows and razor-sharp confidence. Cameron watched her from the shadows of the living room, his white shirt unbuttoned, just enough to reveal the rise and fall of a chest that had long since learned to carry other people's wars. He didn't speak at first. He knew silence could sometimes hold a person more tenderly than any words. But the way his eyes roamed over her, steady, protective, quietly undone by her strength, made something inside Stuart's chest ache with a warmth she didn't want to name yet. She traced a fingertip against the glass, fog blooming beneath her touch. Her reflection fractured between who she was and who she was becoming, and behind that fractured glass, Cameron's reflection stepped closer, a living shadow merging with hers until it felt like the universe itself had narrowed down to the space between their breaths. She whispered almost to herself, "He saw me tonight." Her voice was raw, stripped of the armor she wore like a second skin. Cameron stepped behind her, close enough that his breath warmed the back of her neck, but not close enough to make her feel trapped. He understood boundaries not because someone had taught him, but because he felt her heartbeat, even when she didn't speak. "And?" he murmured, his tone low, steady, unshaken by Mike's ghost. "Did you see the way he trembled?" A sharp, breathless laugh escaped her, the kind that came not from amusement, but from the delicious, dangerous satisfaction of watching a man who thought he'd buried her face, the living proof of his failure. "Yes," she said softly, "but it doesn't erase what he did to me." Her hand trembled slightly, and Cameron caught it gently, lacing their fingers together as though anchoring a storm to something unbreakable. The night air felt charged, electric, shimmering around them like invisible sparks, caught in the pull of something they couldn't name, but both felt burning through their veins. Stuart's heart pounded against her ribs, a rhythm that had once belonged to fear, but now pulsed with something stronger. When Cameron pulled her gently back against his chest, she didn't resist. His warmth seeped through her silk dress like sunlight bleeding through winter glass, soft and patient. For a woman who had clawed her way through betrayal, through flames that weren't just fire but heartbreak, to stand here and let herself lean against someone was more terrifying than confronting Mike himself. But Cameron wasn't Mike. Cameron never asked her to be small to make him feel big. He stood beside her like a fortress, not a cage. In that quiet, a single tear slid down her cheek, shocking even her. Cameron's hand moved up slowly, cupping her jaw, turning her face toward him as though he was handling something fragile but powerful. "You're not what he did to you," he said, the words rolling against the air like a vow carved from granite. Stuart's breath caught. No one had ever said it that way, not as pity, not as some hollow reassurance, but as truth. Her defenses cracked, not with a loud shatter, but a quiet fracture that felt both terrifying and freeing. She tried to hold it in, the memories of flames licking at walls, the echo of Mike's laughter, the scent of betrayal heavy as smoke. But it came in waves she couldn't contain. Her shoulders trembled once, then again, until the dam she'd built over years collapsed into quiet sobs against Cameron's chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't say she was strong or that she shouldn't cry. He just wrapped his arms around her, held her like she was something sacred, something no fire could destroy. The city lights outside blurred as tears clung to her lashes, her breathing uneven against the steady rise and fall of his chest. His heartbeat was steady, the kind of rhythm you could build a life around. She tilted her head up slightly, their foreheads brushing, and the world fell silent. No revenge, no schemes, just the fragile, dangerous pulse of something too real to ignore. "Why are you here?" she whispered. "Because I choose to be," he answered, and the simplicity of it tore through her carefully constructed armor like sunlight through storm clouds. The tension between them pulsed like a live wire, drawing them closer. His thumb brushed against her cheekbone, wiping away the remnants of war disguised as tears. Slowly, as if neither wanted to break whatever fragile magic held them suspended in this moment, his lips found hers. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't claiming. It was slow, deep, grounding. A kiss that whispered, "You are safe," even as the world burned outside. Stuart's hands, once clenched in defense, slid up the front of his shirt, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the thin fabric. Her body molded against his like it had always been meant to fit there, in the space between fire and salvation. For the first time, intimacy didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like coming home to a place she didn't believe existed anymore. Their breaths tangled, heavier, slower, each kiss a soft rebellion against every bruise the past had left behind. The night thickened around them, wrapping them in velvet shadows, and quiet confessions whispered between parted lips. Cameron's fingers traced the line of her spine with reverence, as if memorizing the strength carved into her every scar. "You're fire," he murmured against her mouth, "and I'd rather burn beside you than live a life untouched." She felt something dangerous bloom inside her chest. Not revenge, not hatred, but love. The room tilted in that delicate way where control didn't feel lost, but willingly surrendered. Stuart's fingers tangled in his hair as their kiss deepened, their bodies pressed closer, the heat between them rising like the city below. For years, pain had been the only language she spoke at night, but now her body was learning a new one written in sighs, in the curve of his hands against her skin, in the sound of her own heartbeat whispering, "You're alive." The penthouse disappeared, the ghosts disappeared. All that remained was Cameron's warmth and the soft sound of her name falling from his lips like a promise. Hours passed like seconds, every touch leaving behind something indelible. And when they finally lay tangled beneath the glow of a city that didn't sleep, Stuart stared at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with something new, something terrifyingly beautiful. Peace. Cameron's arm rested beneath her head, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her shoulder, the silence between them not empty, but full, like the quiet before dawn. Mini cliffhanger. Her phone buzzed against the nightstand. The sound sliced through the softness like a blade. Stuart froze, the warmth of their moment clashing with the chill of reality creeping back in. Cameron noticed the way her body tensed immediately, his thumb stilling against her skin. "What is it?" he asked softly, not pushing, just steady. She reached for the phone slowly, her heart already knowing that anything arriving at this hour could never mean something good. The screen lit up, and the name that once owned her nightmares glared back at her. Mike. Her breath caught. One message, 6 words. "I know your secret, Stuart." The warmth between them shattered into ice. The room suddenly felt too quiet, the city outside too far away. Cameron propped himself up on one elbow, reading the flicker of dread in her eyes before she could even speak. "What did he say?" he asked, his tone shifting, still calm, but edged with steel now, protective in a way that sent a tremor through her. Stuart swallowed hard, the phone trembling in her hand, the words burning into her like the fire she thought she had already walked through. She looked at Cameron, the man who'd just wrapped her in something soft and rare, and felt the cold fingers of the past reaching for her again. But this time, she wasn't the same woman who'd once cried alone in the dark. She straightened her shoulders, even beneath the warmth of the sheets, and whispered, "It's starting." Cameron's eyes darkened, not with fear, but with the calm, dangerous resolve of a man who'd burned down the world before letting it touch the woman he loved. He took the phone from her gently, his thumb brushing hers as if reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore. Outside, the wind howled faintly against the glass, a storm gathering far away. Inside, a different kind of storm began to rise, one made of love, rage, and the sharp promise of war. And as Cameron pulled her back against his chest, his lips brushing her temple in silent reassurance, Stuart stared at the message one last time, her heartbeat steadying, a spark of cold fire lighting behind her eyes. She was done hiding. Her lips curved into a dangerous smile as she whispered into the dark, "Then let the game begin." The night after Mike's message, the city seemed to hum with a strange electricity, a quiet before the storm that only the hunted could sense. Stuart sat at the edge of Cameron's bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a halo of gold around her. But her face wasn't the face of a woman afraid anymore. It was the face of a woman ready to burn the world down if it meant never being caged again. Cameron leaned against the doorway, shirt sleeves rolled up, his jaw set in quiet determination. his eyes fixed on her not with pity, but with the unwavering certainty of someone who would fight beside her until the very last breath. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the horizon, a perfect echo of the war about to be unleashed. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence stretch, wrapping around them like silk and steel all at once. Mike thought he could threaten her back into the shadows, but he had forgotten one thing. She had already lived through the worst fire. A message could not scorch her now. Slowly, Stuart stood, her movements smooth, almost regal, her black silk robe falling softly around her like a queen preparing for war. Cameron stepped forward, reaching for her hand, his thumb tracing her pulse like a silent promise. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes, sharp, glinting with something dangerous, was answer enough. The trap had already been set long before Mike ever pressed send. Their plan wasn't born overnight. It was crafted with precision, hidden beneath quiet smiles, whispered strategies, and layers of power Mike never even knew existed. Cameron had opened doors she didn't even know were there, offshore accounts, silent partnerships, buried weaknesses in Mike's empire that he thought were untraceable. But nothing was invisible to Cameron, nothing stayed buried forever when Stuart's name was attached to it. They spent sleepless nights in front of glowing screens and confidential files, their hands brushing as they pored over maps of power and money, each touch a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just revenge, but rebirth. Stuart didn't want his money. She wanted him to feel the silence he left her in when he let her burn. That morning, while the city stirred with its usual indifference, Mike's fortress of glass and arrogance began to crack. Bank alerts pinged like tiny alarms he didn't yet understand. Investors whispered behind polished doors. Silent partners withdrew in panic. A network he had built on charm and lies was unraveling like silk threads cut clean by invisible hands. Mike paced in his office, his once flawless composure melting into panic. He called lawyers, no answers. He called his new fiancée. She didn't pick up. He slammed his fist against his desk as though he could beat the world back into obedience. But this wasn't a world he controlled anymore. This was Stuart's game now. And the Queen had just moved her most dangerous piece. Meanwhile, Stuart watched the cracks spread from Cameron's balcony, sipping black coffee as the morning wind tangled with her hair. Cameron stood beside her, his hand brushing the small of her back, not as possession, but as silent strength. "He's feeling it now," Cameron said quietly, a smile ghosting the corner of his mouth. Stuart didn't smile back. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the empire that once crushed her was now shaking on its golden stilts. "Good," she said softly. "Let him taste what it's like to lose everything you thought would always be yours." She turned to him, their eyes locking with the kind of intensity that lived between two people who had walked through darkness together. Cameron reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't owe him mercy," he whispered. She exhaled slowly, her voice steady. "I know. I owe him silence." It wasn't rage in her tone anymore. It was something colder, something sharper, a calm that frightened even monsters. She picked up her phone, her next move ready. By noon, Mike was cornered. His office, once buzzing with the sound of people bowing to his power, felt empty. His assistant avoided his eyes. Investors hung up on him. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, but none of the calls were salvation. He finally received an invitation he didn't expect, a meeting request with Stuart. She didn't need to threaten him with words. The simple weight of her name in that email made his chest tighten with something he didn't want to name: fear. When Stuart walked into his office, the temperature in the room shifted. She wore black, not the color of mourning, but of command. Her hair framed her face like a crown, and the sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed like a countdown. Mike's breath hitched. For a split second, the ghost of the woman he left in the fire flickered in his mind. But what stood before him wasn't a ghost. It was the fire itself. She didn't flinch. He did. Mike's voice cracked with the weight of desperation he couldn't hide. How are you alive?" he asked, his words almost stumbling over themselves. She tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth curving in something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a blade wrapped in silk. "You really thought you killed me with your silence," she murmured. "That was your mistake, Mike. You taught me how to burn." He moved closer, reaching out, but she stepped back, letting the distance become a wall he couldn't climb anymore. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed, his voice shaking as his power slipped through his fingers. Stuart's eyes hardened like steel. "Oh, I do. You're watching it happen." For the first time, he realized he was the one trapped. Mike tried everything, threats, pleas, bargains that once worked like magic. He whispered promises wrapped in panic, hoping some piece of the woman he betrayed still lived behind those sharp eyes. But Stuart didn't soften. She didn't scream either. She simply walked around his office like it already belonged to her, fingers brushing against the polished desk he once leaned on while signing her death warrant. "This is what it feels like," she said softly, her voice calm, devastating. "To be left in the fire." Cameron appeared in the doorway then, tall, silent, radiating the kind of power Mike could never fake. The subtle way he stood behind her made the message clear. She was no longer someone's weakness. She was someone's war. Mike's breathing quickened, his mask slipping completely now, revealing the terrified man beneath the tailored suits and expensive lies. He slammed his hand on the desk, shouting, "I'll destroy you both!" She didn't even turn around. Stuart paused at the door, sunlight spilling over her shoulders like armor. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply adjusted her coat, her chin lifting with quiet finality. "You already tried," she said, without looking back. "And you failed." Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked out, Cameron falling into step beside her, their silence more lethal than any threat. Behind them, Mike's roar shook the walls, but power wasn't his anymore. It was hers. His empire was falling, but the war had just begun. Cameron reached for her hand as they stepped into the elevator, their fingers lacing together like two pieces of something unstoppable. Stuart didn't smile, not yet. Revenge wasn't about smiling. It was about reclaiming the power she was told she'd never have again. She leaned her head against the cool elevator wall, her heartbeat steady. She had faced the man who once watched her world burn, and this time, she was the one walking away with the match. Far above them, in an office crumbling beneath invisible fire, Mike whispered into the empty air, "This isn't over." And down below, Stuart opened her eyes slowly, her voice a low murmur that cut through the silence like a blade. "It is for you." 8. The elevator doors closed with a low, heavy sound that seemed to seal more than just a floor between them and Mike. It sealed an era. Stuart leaned against the cool steel panel, feeling the pulse beneath her skin thrum like distant thunder. Cameron stood beside her, his tall frame a silent fortress, his hand still holding hers tightly, grounding her in the present while ghosts clawed at the edges of her memory. The fluorescent lights above painted their reflections on the mirrored walls, and for the first time she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. This wasn't the woman who had begged for mercy beneath the fire. This was the woman who had walked through it and built a kingdom out of the ashes. When the elevator slid open into the crisp night, the city stretched before them like an endless canvas of light and ambition. Cameron's car waited at the curb, sleek and black, the engine purring low like a beast ready to obey. Stuart slid into the passenger seat, but her mind was far from the present. Behind her eyelids, she still saw Mike's face. The terror, the cracks in his mask, the way his voice cracked when he realized she was the storm he had created. For years he had controlled the narrative. Now she held the pen and she wasn't writing him a happy ending. Somewhere in the city his empire was already starting to burn. The days that followed were not chaotic. They were surgical. Cameron's lawyers moved like shadows through boardrooms, freezing accounts, unearthing hidden contracts, exposing the rot beneath Mike's polished exterior. Whispers began to ripple through the elite circles that once adored him. Bold allies turned to save themselves, slicing away their loyalty like snakes shedding skin. Headlines started appearing one by one, a scandal here, a lawsuit there, a whistleblower stepping into the light. It wasn't Stuart lighting the fire this time. It was Mike's greed setting everything ablaze from within. In Cameron's penthouse, the two of them watched it unfold from the living room's glass wall, the city twinkling beneath them like the stage of a play that had always belonged to someone else. Until now. Stuart stood barefoot on the polished floor, wrapped in a silk robe, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the table beside her. The television displayed breaking news. Business mogul, Mike under investigation, board members withdraw support. Her heartbeat didn't race. It didn't flutter with revenge. It was steady, calm, because the fire was no longer hers to fight. It was his. Every brick of his empire was turning into ash without her even lifting a hand. Cameron walked up behind her, his chest brushing against her back as his arms slid around her waist. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to remind her that she wasn't standing in this moment as a broken woman seeking justice. She was standing here as a woman who had already claimed it. "You did it," he murmured against her hair. Stuart exhaled softly, her eyes fixed on the news ticker at the bottom of the screen. "No," she whispered back. "He did it to himself." Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. The lawsuits, the media frenzy, the vultures circling around Mike's falling throne. All that remained was the steady rhythm of their breathing and the quiet weight of a victory she had never imagined feeling this way. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was quiet, like the moment after a storm when everything stands still and realizes the monster is gone. But monsters don't always vanish quietly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Mike's world cracked like glass beneath a hammer. His so-called allies turned their backs one by one, their carefully rehearsed smiles gone. Lawyers who once begged to be in his shadow were now slipping away through side doors. His accounts froze, assets locked, reputation shredded in front of flashing cameras. For years he had fed the machine of greed, and now it was devouring him whole. Reporters camped outside his glass tower, microphones ready like vultures waiting to pick at a carcass. Security guards who once jumped at his command avoided his gaze. His fiancée, the woman he paraded as proof of his success, vanished without a word. His voice echoed through empty halls, shouting orders no one followed anymore. Somewhere deep inside, panic clawed at his chest, because for the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless. He whispered her name like a curse. Stuart. Back at the penthouse, Cameron handed Stuart a glass of water and gently tilted her chin toward him. His eyes weren't filled with triumph. They were filled with something softer. Admiration, pride, love, woven through unspoken understanding. "You didn't just survive," he said slowly, deliberately, as if every word carried weight. "You conquered." She let the words settle between them like the glow of a dying fire. Soft, warm, final. It wasn't revenge that made her stronger. It was the journey that carried her here. She walked to the mirror, the same one she had stood before months ago, back when the reflection was a stranger. This time, the woman looking back had fire in her veins and power in her stance. The scars on her skin no longer looked like reminders of pain, they looked like maps of survival, each line a path she walked through hell to return. Stuart lifted her chin slightly, a soft, proud smile playing at the corner of her lips. She wasn't just alive, she was reborn, but fate wasn't finished with its final strike. The night the police came for Mike, the air was heavy, charged with something thick and electric. Stuart and Cameron stood side by side, watching the live news feed as flashing red and blue lights lit up the screen. Mike stumbled out of his building, his once immaculate suit crumpled, his hair disheveled, his arrogance gone. He shouted at the officers, at the cameras, at the world, but no one was listening anymore. The king had fallen, and no one bows to a king in chains. Stuart's fingers curled around Cameron's hand as the officers pulled Mike's wrists behind his back, cold steel closing with a click that echoed like poetry. Her breath hitched, not out of fear, not even out of triumph, but because this moment was real. She had imagined it 1,000 times in the darkness of her hospital room. Now it wasn't a fantasy, it was happening in full color. And then his eyes found hers through the camera. The cameraman panned across the street, and for a single second, Mike stared into the lens like he could burn through it. The anchor said his name. The crowd murmured. But all Stuart saw was the raw, feral hatred in his eyes. He screamed her name across the chaos, spit flying, voice cracking with the venom of a man who had finally met the edge of the fire he once controlled. "You'll never be free of me," he roared, his voice breaking against the wall of sirens and flashing lights. The sound cut through the room, but Stuart didn't flinch. Cameron tightened his grip on her hand, and she drew in a slow, steady breath. Her heart didn't race. It beat like a war drum, steady and calm because she finally understood something he never would. She didn't need his permission to be free. She had already taken it. The monster was caged, but echoes of him still lingered in the smoke. The screen faded to black as the police van doors slammed shut behind him. The city moved on like it always does. And in the quiet after the storm, Stuart stood taller than she ever had. No tears, no shaking, just strength. She turned toward Cameron, and his hand slid around her waist, pulling her close. His forehead touched hers softly, not like someone claiming victory, but like someone honoring survival. Stuart whispered into the quiet night, "I am free." And somewhere, far away in a dark van, Mike's scream echoed into the void, no longer the sound of a king, but of a man who finally lost everything. The night wrapped itself around the city like a velvet cloak, stars hanging like witnesses to the quiet storm that had already passed. Stuart stood on the balcony of her new home, high above the world that once tried to bury her, the soft night breeze tangling in her hair, carrying the faint scent of freedom and victory. The city beneath her feet sparkled, not as something she once feared, but as a kingdom she had conquered piece by piece, breath by breath, pain by pain. Every light in the skyline reminded her of a night she thought she wouldn't survive, every distant car horn a memory of the woman who once begged to be seen, to be loved, to be saved. That woman was gone. This one, the one standing barefoot on marble, shoulders squared, eyes fierce, had been forged in fire. Behind her, the gentle sound of footsteps echoed, familiar, steady, grounding. Cameron stepped out, dressed in black, his presence wrapping around her like warmth in the middle of winter. His hands slipped around her waist, fingers tracing the shape of the woman he had fallen in love with. Not out of pity, not out of need to protect, but because her strength drew him like gravity itself. She leaned back against him, her heartbeat steady, no longer trembling at the thought of the man who once left her to die. Mike's face flickered in her memory like a dying flame. The shock when he saw her alive, the rage when his empire cracked, the hollow scream when the handcuffs closed around his wrists. It used to give her nightmares. Now, it gave her power. He had thought he was untouchable, but he had forgotten that a woman who rises from fire fears nothing anymore. Stuart exhaled slowly, the cool air filling her lungs like the first breath of a new life. Cameron kissed her shoulder softly, a touch not of possession but of reverence, and whispered against her skin, "You're not just free, Stuart. You're untouchable." Those words didn't cage her. They crowned her. Inside the house, the walls bore no traces of the past, no photos of pain, no shadows of betrayal, only windows that opened to the night sky and chandeliers that burned brighter than the flames that once tried to consume her. She turned slightly to face him, her eyes reflecting the city lights like diamonds, not because of wealth, but because of survival. "Do you know what I see when I look out there now?" she asked softly, her voice steady, strong. Cameron tilted his head, the faintest smile touching his lips. "What?" he whispered back. "The world that thought it could break me," she said, stepping away slowly, her bare feet gliding over marble. "But I didn't just survive it. I built something on top of its ruins." She walked to the edge of the balcony, hands resting lightly on the railing, the wind catching her hair like a crown of fire. Somewhere down there, people spoke her name, not with pity, but with power. Stuart, the woman who returned from the ashes. Stuart, the woman who took down the man who tried to erase her. Stuart, the woman who became a storm. The night carried whispers of her story through the streets like folklore, a tale of survival turned into legend. Cameron joined her, their shoulders touching lightly. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where a prince saved the princess. It was something stronger. She saved herself. And he stood beside her, not as a savior, but as a witness to her becoming. He was the hand she held, not the one she clung to. Together, they had built an empire of silence and precision, an alliance sharper than any blade. His wealth opened doors, but her fire burned through walls. His power gave her space, but her strength lit the path. Far away, Mike sat behind cold bars, his screams echoing against concrete, fading like the sound of a man who had lost everything. He had built his empire on lies, manipulation, and cruelty, never imagining that the woman he tried to bury would become the storm that ended him. And even now, he whispered her name in rage, in disbelief, in helplessness. But she didn't hear it anymore. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than his scream. Cameron brushed a strand of hair from her face and tucked it behind her ear, the kind of gesture that said everything words couldn't. "What's next, Queen?" he teased lightly, but there was something deeper beneath. Respect, awe, devotion. She turned to him, her eyes softening, a small, real smile touching her lips. "Whatever I want," she answered. The world no longer dictated her fate. She did. She walked back inside slowly, trailing her fingers along the cold glass of the balcony door, the sound of the city dimming behind her like a conquered beast. The home smelled like jasmine and possibility, like something new that couldn't be tainted by the past. In the living room, her name was etched on a sleek black plaque on the wall, not as a reminder of pain, but as a declaration of power. Stuart. No last name, no attachment to the man who tried to erase her. Just her, a woman reborn. As Cameron followed her in, she turned suddenly, catching him by surprise. Her hand cupped his jaw gently, pulling him closer. Her kiss wasn't desperate or broken like it once might have been. It was steady, claiming, powerful. This wasn't love born from rescue. It was love between equals. Two storms colliding and choosing to build together. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts steady. "I rose from the fire," she whispered, and this time the words didn't taste like pain. They tasted like victory. Outside, the city roared. Inside, silence reigned like a crown. She stood in the center of the room, not a victim, not a survivor, but a queen. Somewhere far in the distance, darkness still lingered. Power always attracted new enemies, new storms. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Her heart had walked through fire. Her soul had survived betrayal. And now, with Cameron by her side, with her empire beneath her feet, there was nothing left to fear. The wind shifted through the open balcony door, lifting the curtains like the wings of something unstoppable. She raised her chin, feeling the night air kiss her face, and for a heartbeat she saw the little girl she once was, scared, small, burning in silence. Then she saw the woman she became, fierce, unshakable, blazing. Somewhere in the darkness, a new chapter of power and love was just beginning. Not the kind written for her, but the kind she would write herself, with ink made of strength, with hands that no longer trembled, with a crown not made of gold, but of fire. And that's how a woman who was left to burn rose like a queen and turned her pain into power. If this story touched your heart, make sure you show some love, like, share, and most importantly, subscribe to Beyond Color Stories. I want to hear from you, my family. Tell me where you're listening from and what part of the story hit you the hardest. Your support keeps this family growing and these powerful stories alive. Until next time, stay strong, stay fearless, and never forget, your story matters.